Following is an AZPM original production.
And welcome to the special Election Week edition of the Press Room from AZPM's radio studios. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Distinguished panel of journalists joining us today: Caitlin Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star, and Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being here today. Caitlin, let's start off with something we've talked about a lot on this program, the Pima County Sheriff's race. As we're taping this on Friday morning, nothing is official, but it looks like Sheriff Nanos is heading for re-election. I want to ask the surprise question because we've talked so much about the controversy related to him and suspending his opponent, Heather Lappin, and the fight with Arizona Luminaria. What do you make of the fact that it looks like he's still going to win this? Yeah,
he's up by about 10,000 votes right now. I think it just shows how hesitant Democrats in Pima County are from straying from that side of the ticket. He definitely made headlines, and still, that's a lot of votes to be leading by.
Tim, did it show any weakness of any kind? Like, did people expect him to win by 20,000 votes?
Yeah, I think that would be the case. You would expect him to win by a margin larger than what he's winning by if you remove these controversies. But he had an opponent who was decent, good, strong Republican. So honestly, it's about as close perhaps as it can get right now.
So Chris, does that indicate to you there was an impact based on this controversy?
I think there was an impact, but I think part of the reason there was not a larger impact was timing, because early voting had already started when all of this happened and came out. If it had happened a month earlier or the election were a month longer, which blissfully it was not, but I think we would have seen that race tighten even more. Could Heather Lappin, a Republican, beat Chris Nanos, a Democrat in Pima County? I'm not willing to put money on that one yet, but I think that race, given a little different timing, could have been much tighter.
So, Tim, based on what we know about Sheriff Nanos' personality, will this empower him in some way? Will it humble him in any way? Should we expect the same Sheriff Nanos?
Yeah, I would expect the same Sheriff Nanos. And I think one thing that's interesting, that's going to be different in the dynamic, is now he's going to be sheriff with Republican President Donald Trump. And he will likely be a more resistant sheriff than Lappin would have been if she had been elected to whatever initiatives might involve a sheriff's department. I'm thinking, of course, of rounding up people who are in the country illegally. So as a result, we've got this kind of Democratic bulwark against Trump to a certain extent, I think.
Yeah. Caitlin, what do you make of that?
I think it'll be interesting to see the impact to the department. We had heard that deputies would be leaving. There was talk of a mass exodus if he was reelected. And so I think we sit and see. I think if you work in the Tucson Police Department right now, you should be looking at ways to make some lateral hires, because that could be a great opportunity to increase staffing over there.
Well, and one of the things we asked Heather Lappin on election night was, if you lose, do you stay? Because she is still suspended. That, at least as of the taping of this, I have not heard that has been lifted. And let's just say she was non-committal. She didn't say, yes, I'm staying, but she didn't say, no, I'm leaving either. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with her going forward, and Aaron Cross, the sergeant who was involved in all of this, not running, but a strong supporter of Lappin. What happens to all of them going forward is an interesting question. It's just too early to tell at this point.
These internal politics really heighten the contrast between the recent few years and the Dupnik era. My goodness, we had all those decades where the same guy was going to win even if someone ran against him. And now there's just really sharp personal political politics in the department. And it's got to be hard to run a department, whoever you are, when you've got people who are going to be gunning for your office.
Are there any pending lawsuits left, Tim, related to Lappin, Cross, Nanos?
Yeah. The Aaron Cross lawsuit in federal court is still pending, but they decided not to do a temporary restraining order, as I recall. But still, the broader issue of whether he did something wrong is still to be hashed out, I believe.
And we know going forward with protests, we know how people are going to dress at least. So that's...
We do. And it'll also be interesting to see what happens to the staff members that openly supported Lapin. Chris Nanos has a reputation for being a bit vindictive to people that don't support him, and a lot of people put their names out there.
To his credit, when I talked to him about this issue of vindictiveness, he pulled out a sheaf of papers. It was a petition, something like a petition. It was employees of the department who were assigned to oppose him and support Mark Napier in the previous election. And he said, I kept this person, I promoted that person, and he went through the list. So there are people, there are some significant cases of him just ignoring people who opposed him.
Not to cast aspersions, but internal politics, we may not know how he really treats those folks, though. There might be some silent stuff. We never know.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. And this, I think, going forward, I'm guessing at least the three of us at this table and anybody else who'd be sitting at this table will be watching very carefully, as will, I think, to some level, the federal court, because even once the Aaron Cross case is settled, you now have put this on the radar of a federal judge who may not be actively watching, but it is on their radar. And it could come back with other employees if there is retaliation.
Yeah. Several races I want to ask you all about, but Tim, since you alluded to the idea of a bulwark against President Trump, generally, how do you think that will affect Pima County, the Tucson area that is pretty far left of center, and you have the return of Donald Trump to the White House?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of federal funding. For example, the city of Tucson under Joe Biden got a lot of federal funding through the mayor's office, and I expect that'll dry up. And I expect, Trump is not known for his magnanimity. And so, to the extent he can punish people who cross him, he does. And so I don't expect there to be a lot of help for Tucson. But on the other hand, we're kind of small potatoes. We're a little provincial, so they may not care that much about us.
Well, Caitlin, obviously we saw the experience of 2016 to 2020. Obviously that was dramatically changed by the pandemic. But do you expect something similar for him to treat communities like Tucson and Pima County to either ignore them or do not great things to them?
I mean, I suspect so. I think the impact here could be different this time around because since then we've elected a new mayor and council largely that have very different priorities than we did before. The environment is a huge one, as well as, increasing affordable housing and all of that. So I think some of the priorities that we have here locally might not jive with his priorities at a federal level. So in addition to lack of funding, who knows what'll happen there.
Environmental issues I think are going to be a big area when you consider all the federal land that's around here and the border wall, of course, going up.
And Tucson Mayor Regina Romero was very active on the campaign trail for Vice President Harris. So there may be some issues there. And then as we get into the implementation of Prop 314, which allows state troopers to be enforcing border law, we know that's going to court. We've been down this road before with 1070, but still there's going to be some time. What does Chris Nanos, a Democratic sheriff, do with that versus Mark Daniels, a Republican sheriff in Cochise County? I think a lot of these things, this will be stuff we talk about on this show and amongst ourselves for probably the next 4 years.
Well, Caitlin, the mention of 314 is an important one because as we're recording on Friday morning, a lot of these races, as I said earlier, are not decided. That one was decided pretty early in the evening. We saw polls that indicated that's the way it would go, but does that indicate to you that there's a changing tide again, the pendulum is swinging back? Or, again, do people believe this was not as harsh as 1070?
I mean, I think there was a lot of fear about fentanyl and deaths related to that, and the rhetoric around that is largely focusing on border. And so I think that drove people to support it, people that might not have otherwise. A lot of Latino voters in Arizona supported 314, which seems counterintuitive, but when you bring up this death toll, it starts to make more sense.
And then there's sort of I keep thinking about the guest worker concept of this, and of course E-Verify. I don't know if people really care about E-Verify that much, but that also was a point that seemingly people on both sides could get on board with. They said, well, I don't mind if people are undocumented as long as we kind of know why they're here and that they're registered as far as some system to be employed. Does that appeal to moderates in some way, Tim? I don't know.
if you're not in the position to have your benefits tested by E-Verify, then I'm sure you're happy to have other people go through that. And it may not be that big a barrier, but on the other hand, I don't know. It's a majority of Arizonans imposing a restriction on a minority of Arizonans.
And of course, we still have to wait and see if it ever actually goes into effect.
Yeah.
Because
we're watching Texas closely on that too.
Well, exactly, because it is tied to Texas. And if it goes into effect, because the Texas law goes into effect, someone is still going to challenge it in court. Just because one court lets it go in doesn't mean someone won't come up with another question. So I think this one, nothing is changing soon, I don't think, on this one.
So the other measure that passed by a wide margin was Prop 139, which affects abortion and reproductive rights. And Caitlin, I know people have probably asked this on all the networks, but let's sort of dig in a little bit. We have Arizona, where Donald Trump's going to win by a large margin. Ruben Gallego will probably win. That'll be a narrow margin at this point. And then we have two measures, one that's very pro-extra border security, giving more local law enforcement a chance, and then also reproductive rights. And these things passed by a tremendous amount. Crossover vote on that, or again, where Arizonans are odd?
I mean, that did surprise me, that they are in stark contrast of each other. It seems like we want to give more rights to one classification of people and then take them away from another one. But I mean, I think Yes for 139 ran a hell of a campaign and really got the word out on that. I was surprised to see it pass that strongly. I didn't think it would be that wide of a margin, but
I mean, apparently a lot of Trump supporters also support abortion rights, and I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise, but it's a little bit surprising. And a good number also support Ruben Gallego over Kari Lake.
And we saw Doug Ducey and Kirsten Sinema with 150,000 votes that supposedly were crossed over there too.
Well, and we saw a picture, someone in our newsroom showed it to me last week, I think it was taken out up in Phoenix, of a yard sign that said Trump Gallego.
Yes. In Scottsdale, yes.
There were those crossover voters. Our AZPM's Paolo Rodriguez, the day after the election, talked to an abortion provider up in Phoenix and their staff. And one of the things they're now worried about is, okay, 139 is going in the Constitution. What happens now that Donald Trump has been elected? Is there a move for a federal abortion ban? So they're back in this little bit of no man's land, not sure what they're going to do. The provider's happy to see 139 go, but now they wonder. But as Tim said, in order for that to have passed, a lot of Trump supporters had to have voted for it. So there may not be the political stomach for a federal ban.
But this helps Republicans in the state, Caitlin, because they never have to hear 1864 again.
That's right. They moved past that one. Great.
Yeah.
But there is going to be some resistance and efforts. I know Mark Fincham, famously formerly Tucson area resident and representative, now representing the Prescott area in the state Senate. He is saying he's going to try to correct this wrong. He's a bit on the extreme, and I doubt that a majority of the bodies in the legislature are going to want to reopen this, but some will.
Yeah, we're seeing the legislative makeup. Democrats put a lot of money into it, but we're not seeing them gain seats that they had hoped to gain. So,
yeah.
Caitlin, let me go to, I was thinking we'd talk a lot about CD6, but it's so close that by the time a lot of people see this, who knows who will be ahead at this point. But this is, I don't want to say tighter than last time that Engel and Ciscomani ran, but it's almost as tight. I mean, I hate to ask this question. What's going on there? Like, why is it just so close, considering that Ciscomani was an incumbent? You think he'd have a tiny incumbent advantage there?
I mean, you would think, but she had the advantage this time around that he had a record to attack, and she went after it hard throughout her entire campaign. Again, reproductive rights was another big issue. He didn't gain a lot of fans with his stance on that one, and she came down on him hard. But yeah, it is interesting that we're seeing she's ahead by 200 votes as of when we're recording this right now, which is very, very close to what he won by last time. So.
And it's been closer than that. At one point yesterday, it was 68 votes that she was ahead, then Ciscomani was ahead, then she was ahead, then Ciscomani was ahead, and now she's ahead again, all within about the last 12 hours at the time we're sitting here. And, Ciscomani, yes, he's an incumbent, but the conventional wisdom is if you're going to beat a U.S. House member, the only time they're beatable as an incumbent is that first re-election, and this is his first re-election. So this was the time, if the Democrats were going to pick him off, this was the time they were most likely to be able to do it.
So, Tim, we're watching kind of Pima County versus Cochise County to see who can come out ahead, because obviously Cochise is more favorable to Ciscomani.
And Pinal. Pinal is a more Republican-leaning county in that district. An interesting part of the dynamic, though, is that if you look at the politics within the Republican Party, Juan Ciscomani is not beloved by the right wing of the Republican Party, which is a big part of the party. And I've seen people saying, people who run in the middle, the only thing in the middle of the road is roadkill, right? That's a famous phrase, and it's hard to know if he had run a harder right campaign. I can't imagine him winning. So I don't know. I don't believe that point of view, but it's out there in the right wing of the Republican Party.
That district, you have to run in the middle. Just as the 20 years almost that I've been here, from Jim Colby to Gabby Giffords to Ron Barber to Martha McSally to Ann Kirkpatrick, we switch back and forth, and to Juan Ciscomani, but that district, no matter what you number it and how it's drawn, sure, it leans Republican now, but it's still pretty close on that 30-30-30 split. So you've always had to run down the middle.
Well, and Chris, no matter how the U.S. House ends up with the 435, it's going to be incredibly tight. You're either going to have a 2 or 3 vote advantage for the Republicans or 2 or 3 vote advantage for Democrats. So that might actually put Ciscomani in a good position. Being a moderate Republican.
Being a moderate Republican, he's already on appropriations, so that's a big spot, especially for a freshman to have gotten. So it could help him. If Engel is elected, who knows, as we said, 200 votes as we're sitting here now. It may have changed since we hit record. It'll be interesting to see how she would play as a freshman, and I think some of it depends which side of the majority she's on, and we're not going to know that for a couple of days probably.
Yeah. Caitlin, understanding that they're running from different parties, if they were honest during their debates, how different are they in terms of actual practice if they were in Congress?
I mean, yeah, that's that's the question, right? I mean, I don't think all that different, but
I mean, I think there's a big difference between being a Democrat who, for example, will vote to investigate people in the Trump administration, which they would do if they got the majority, and being a Republican who would vote against that. That sort of thing will make a big difference.
All right, let's look at a couple more local races. I'm avoiding U.S. Senate. We will get there for a minute or so. Pima County Attorney, Chris Conover. Let's make sure that viewers and listeners know you're not actually related to Laura Conover.
No, Laura Conover is not my wife, my sister, or a cousin, as far as we have been able to tell. We've explored this a couple of times. We have no family cross.
So let's talk about a pretty major protest vote that happened in that race to a lot of people.
At this point, the Green Party candidate has gotten 23% of that vote, which for a Green Party candidate is a huge number. The Green Party will certainly champion that number. I think other people will look at it and say, that was more of a protest vote than it was a pro-Green Party vote. But it is still, to Laura Conover, should be a little bit of a wake-up that a Green Party candidate could pull 23% of the vote. She needs to be aware of that. Mm-hmm. Obviously not enough to defeat her. She got the rest of it. But it's still a big protest vote in there.
Was it a protest of the left or of the right? Do we know?
Well, there is also that problem. Yeah. Is it a protest of her, or is it a protest trying to tell the Republicans they should have run somebody? Mm-hmm. Who knows?
Yeah, Caitlin, how would we know when there's 23%? Is there anything that has stood out about how Pima County Attorney Conover has handled her business that she would get this sort of 23% protest? I
mean, Mike Jetty, who ran against her in the Democratic primary, came after her very hard. She has answered a lot of questions about staffing and employee turnover, some divisions with victim services, the way cases are moving through the court system. So, yeah, I mean, that was one of the more heated races in the primary, I think probably the most heated. Mm-hmm. So, it's a surprisingly high number, but also not.
Well, yeah, I mean, Mike Jetty, one counterfactual that's interesting to entertain is Mike Jetty ran as an independent as a Democrat in the Democratic primary. And we imagine if he had run as a Republican or an independent in the general election, what would have happened? I imagine Laura Conover probably would have won, but I'm guessing he would have taken a lot more votes than he did in the Democratic primary.
Chris, let's close briefly with the idea that Pima County Supervisors, again, looks like it's going to be 4-1 Democratic advantage, although that fifth one with Steve Christie is also kind of bouncing back and forth. Steve
Christie, for a while, was behind. We were all sitting in the newsroom saying, wow, that's interesting. And he, as of our sitting down here, he is back ahead. So, yeah, it will be 4-1 once again. The incumbents all won easily. Adelita Grijalva, 72%. Matt Hines didn't do quite that well, I don't think, but it was close. There were no 65, I think, 65. Yeah, there were no surprises other than for a while Steve Christie was behind.
Yeah, that is Christopher Conover of AZPM. Also with us, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star and Caitlin Schmidt of Tucson Spotlight. I'm Steve Goldstein. You are watching and listening to the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM, and now we turn to a special guest joining us via Zoom from Maricopa County, Mike Noble of Noble Predictive Insights. Mike, hope you can hear us. How are you?
Oh, I can hear you, and good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially after the dust has settled.
Yes. Well, and let me ask you the first question related to the presidential race, because you run a lot of numbers when it comes to national and statewide. So Joe Biden, we know, controversially pulled out the 2020 vote in Arizona, but now it looks like President-elect Donald Trump is going to win Arizona by about 6 points. Did you anticipate that based on your polling, and what were the factors that led that? Not the fact that the former president ended up winning Arizona, but by this margin.
Yeah, no, we expected, we put on our final poll of record that Trump was going to win Arizona. The question just was by how much. I think the surprise is how well he did. I think that was a surprise not only here locally, but nationally. And what we've seen, at least with Trump, is that he just really outperformed compared to his 2020 run. I mean, he just really juiced up the numbers in the rural counties. Harris, did improve or either met Biden where he was at or just below, but she didn't really increase. And the biggest thing that happened compared to 2020 when Trump lost Arizona by 11,000 votes is that there's several self-inflicted wounds that he did leading up to Election Day that really shot himself in the foot, such as trash talking McCain, and also telling everybody to vote day of instead of early. So, I mean, he, when looking at it, he wasn't making the same mistakes. He was running, frankly, a better campaign. And also the big indicator for us was what voters cared about, the economy, pocketbook issues. And when they looked at who they trusted more on that issue, they trusted Trump in double digits more than Harris.
So before we hear from the rest of the panel, I want to ask you one more, because in the course of our previous conversation before you joined us, Chris Conover mentioned that, and I'm living in Scottsdale myself, I saw this sign. There was a Trump-Gallego sign. If Ruben Gallego pulls it out, it's going to be a much more narrow margin than former President Trump. But, I mean, Mike, just how many crossover votes are there, and does that make any sense to you that there would be this many people who could vote for Trump and Gallego?
Oh, we expected it. I mean, that was one thing, is that the margin with us will probably be just barely within a margin of error. But the big thing was the trends, all the trends that we saw, everything is held true. And so when you look at, we expected, Trump to literally perform the best on the ticket, which he has. And when it came to down ticket, is that Ruben, Lake was obviously underperforming Trump the entire time. I think I was interviewing the day of Election Day before results even came in. And I told him, I go, it really matters how Trump performs. If the top of the ticket overperforms expectations, you're going to see that be very beneficial down ticket, and that could pull Lake across the finish line. But Trump would have to win the election by 6 points or more, because that's how far below Lake has been performing. But there's also an interesting thing, not just of the Lake Gallego voters, because it was about 2-1 party disaffected voters of Republicans that were voting for Lake but sticking with Trump. And then also they voted yes on Trump, voted yes for Democrat Gallego, then yes on abortion.
And Mike, that's Christopher Conover, and that's exactly what I was going to ask about. For people who are not used to Arizona voters, Can you explain to them why they voted yes on Trump and yes on 139, the abortion? I've had so many questions about that from friends and family across the country who just don't understand Arizona voters.
Well, Arizona's changed. I mean, compared to a decade ago, we were very socially conservative, but that has changed over the last decade. And part of that change, too, it's accelerated due to the rise of Donald Trump, which is essentially the populist movement. I mean, the conservative Republicans of old who used to dominate the state, well, they're basically been pushed out. And who's running things now is this populist wing, which they're just more moderate on it. And plus, when we polled it, I mean, in general, like even for like our polling on the abortion measure, I think we said it'd be at like 57% of the vote that would pass by, but probably upwards of 60, low 60s. And they're just pro-choice now when it comes to it. They've really moved on that. They become more socially moderate when it comes to these issues where they used to be very socially conservative prior.
We were just talking about how tight the race in CD6 is yet again. Any surprise there for you all, or did you expect this to be a close one like last time?
Oh, no, it was absolutely really close. I mean, because here's the thing. Of the 400 some odd seats that are in Congress, there's about 20 seats that are targeted as true toss-up battlegrounds. And we had Arizona's 1st district with Schweiker and Arizona's 6th district with Siscomani. And you saw that Siscomani, he actually, Biden carried his district actually in 2020 by about a point, but yet Juan still won his district by getting enough Biden crossover voters or Democratic crossover voters. And so we knew it was going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight. And I mean, that's why they're called battlegrounds, because they're incredibly competitive. And also money-wise, Siscomani was also outspent in that race, and having a rematch against Engel, which someone who's already ran the district and already had some groundwork laid, and so we knew it was going to be pretty competitive. But it was kind of surprising. I thought Juan would actually slightly do better than Schweiker performance-wise, but it seems, competitive-wise, I think Engel's really giving a run for his money.
Hi, it's Tim Steller. What are you seeing as far as Hispanic voters and their shifts? Have they shifted in Arizona toward Trump a lot and toward Republicans in general?
Yeah, and it's not a massive shift, but it's just in a gradual shift. Perfect example. In 2020, you had Biden carried Hispanic Latinos, which make up a pretty large chunk of our electorate, and they moved there. He won them by about 25 points in 2020. And I think the exit polls, roughly for Harris, I think it was like Hispanic Latinos either plus 12 or 14. So you've seen this degradation, not as large as you've seen as such as like in Florida, with the Cuban component of Hispanic Latinos, but they've definitely shifted. Have been slowly, gradually shifting to the right, but Harris definitely underperformed compared to Biden's margin when it comes to that core swing group.
Mike, very quick, we need about 20 seconds on this one. Does this election put the purple Arizona to bed, at least for a few years?
No, I think we're going to be a battleground state for the next decade or so. I think, frankly, the selection of what we see results, this is really a byproduct of down ticket. I mean, with Trump incredibly overperforming, kind of switching up the game right now in politics, it really benefited everybody down ticket. Look no further than the Corporation Commission.
Mike Noble of Noble Predictive Insights. Mike, thanks as always for the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to our panelists as well, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star, Chris Conover of AZPM, and Caitlin Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight. But since this is a special edition of the Press Room on AZPM, a full 1 hour, stay with us because more to come. A couple of analysts will tell us what they thought of the results. We'll also get into a little bit of Arizona election law. The question that's asked so often, why does it take so long to count the ballots? Stay with us.
Spend your Thanksgiving holiday in the Yorkshire Dales with a 2-day All Creatures Great and Small Marathon on PBS 6. Join James, Siegfried, Helen, Mrs. Hall, Tricky Woo, and all his furry friends on their adventures in Skelldale House. And get ready for Season 5 coming to PBS 6 in January. The All Creatures Great and Small Marathon starting Thursday, November 28th, only on PBS 6.
And welcome back to this special edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll hear from a couple of pundits for their analysis of what happened and has not quite been fully counted yet in Arizona. But I'm rejoined by Christopher Conover of AZPM because I wanted to talk about that particular question. We both get these questions from across the country, and people say, and people who are not being malicious about it, they just wonder, why does it seem to take so long for Arizona to count up all its ballots? So to us, it seems fairly normal, but why does it seem so abnormal to the rest of the country?
Well, and I hate to say this, Steve, it's not just people across the country. I have journalist friends around the world, one from Germany, one from Slovenia, both asked me this question this week. Why does Arizona take so long? It really comes down to, this is what it is supposed to do. This is the way we have designed our system. Those of us who have been in Arizona for a long time know we vote early by mail. The vast majority of people vote up to 30 days early by mail. Not a problem. We sign the outside of that envelope. It goes off to the counties. The county checks our signatures, which is very important. And if everything matches up, off it goes to counting, not a problem. Where we get slowed down is in Arizona. If you haven't mailed that ballot in by Election Day, and it's not mail it in by Election Day, it has to arrive at the county by Election Day, you can take it to any polling place and drop it off, which is very convenient for those of us who live in Arizona and maybe we forgot to vote, or with a long ballot like we had this year, you wanted more time to do research and things like that. Those ballots, and there are hundreds of thousands of them that get dropped off on Election Day, those signatures still have to be verified. That does not begin until the day after the election. So we go through, the county election officials, and start verifying signatures the day after Election Day. They might not get them all done on Wednesday. They probably won't. But maybe there's a problem with a signature. Maybe you're right-handed and you broke your arm, so you decided you would sign with your left hand, and your signature is completely different. The county recorder will call you, get in touch with you, and say, hey, Steve, why is your signature so different? Come down and prove to us that you are you. And by law, there's 5 days to do that. So that 5 days starts when there's a problem. Maybe that's Wednesday, maybe that's Thursday, maybe it's today, Friday. So it just takes longer.
So one other thing, before we went on, to pull back the curtain a bit, you and I were talking about how many elections you've covered. I've covered many, but not as many as you, partly because you've done this a little bit longer, but also because Tucson has more frequent elections. Tell me what you thought about this one going in. Yes, we heard about bomb threats. I think a lot of people going in were wondering, are there going to be people with AK-47s outside ballot areas? What did you find? Was it relatively low-key based on what people's expectations might have been?
And this sounds so strange, other than the bomb threats, yes, it was relatively low-key. Here in Pima County, we had 2 bomb threats that were emailed in, one to the county recorder's office and one to elections headquarters where they count the ballots. These both came in between 6 and 6:30 on election night, so polls were still open at that point. Police department went to both locations, as you would expect them to do, and checked there were no bombs, and everything continued as normal. Other counties had similar problems, did slow some things down. Secretary of State Adrian Fontes on Election Day held a brief media availability, and one of the questions he was asked was, where are these emails coming from? He did not want to directly point a finger, but they all had a .ru ending on them, which implies Russia. He did not say it was the Russian government. He was not pointing that finger, but he said the real purpose of it was to put some chaos out there, whoever was doing this. And it did cause some slowdown and some problems. And bomb threats have to be taken seriously.
Yeah. Christopher Conover of AZPM, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Press Room continues after this with a couple of pundits, Jaime Molera and Roy Herrera, giving their perspective on what happened on Election Day in Arizona. Stay with us.
I'm Tom McNamara. You know, I've been host of Arizona Illustrated for over a decade now, and I'm so proud of the hundreds of stories we've done. Stories that highlight and showcase the deep roots that support the vibrant and dynamic lifestyle of Southern Arizona. So join us for Arizona Illustrated Community Connections as we bring you a special extended episode that focuses on our relationship with the community. Arizona Illustrated Community Connections.
Welcome back to the press room on AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Now we turn to some analysis of what happened in Arizona on Election Day. Our guests are Jaime Molera, former state superintendent of public instruction, and he works with Molera Alverez, and Roy Herrera, attorney and former congressional staffer. Gentlemen, great to reconnect with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Jaime, let's start off with the U.S. Senate race in Arizona. And we're going to throw the numbers in a certain direction, but let me ask you first, how frustrated would the Republican Party generally be with the decision of voters to nominate Kari Lake again? There were a lot of folks who thought that with I'll say a more conventional Republican, maybe Karen Taylor Robeson, there would be a Republican on the ninth floor in Arizona, and maybe a Republican would have won this seat. We don't know. Ruben Gallego obviously ran a great campaign, well-known congressman. But how frustrating is that for Republicans generally that Kari Lake is probably going to lose another race here?
Well, it's very frustrating. I think you're absolutely right. Most of us would agree when she ran that she would be difficult to beat in a primary. But had almost any other Republican would have run, even a David Schweikert, for instance. While I think Ruben ran a masterful campaign, I think he was very disciplined, stayed on message. I think the Republicans would have fared better. I mean, just because of what happened nationally. I think you saw just a very strong turnout for Republicans. But Kari's relationship with the party was greatly damaged, and there was a lot of Republicans that just didn't care for her, particularly Republican women. So I think at the end of the day, she was probably the best candidate for the Democrats to have.
Yeah, Roy, Ruben Gallego obviously is an outstanding candidate, ran a good campaign. His bio is amazing. But there were some who, before this campaign, were wondering if he was too left of center. Obviously giving credit where credit is due, certainly. Was he aided by the fact that he was running against Kari Lake?
Well, I think a lot of it is, and I agree with Jaime, Ruben ran an incredible campaign. I think it was a highly disciplined campaign that stayed on the right messaging. And so I think, like, when I look at this race, you see, Trump winning the state. I think, he's in the sort of 5 to 6 points range, and Ruben is going to significantly, outperform Harris in the state. So that means, just by math, that there are a number of Trump Gallego voters. And so the messaging that, the Gallego campaign had, I think really resonated with them. I mean, if you think about some of the things he focused on, obviously a lot on the fact that, he's comes from the working class. He's had to work for, everything that he's had to accomplish in his life, put food on the table, obviously focused a lot on his military service. I think he took the right position on issues like immigration and law and order issues. So all those things, I think, ended up working, and that explains, how well he did in comparison to the rest of the Democrats. So I think it's really that difference in how he ran the campaign that explains what occurred. Is Lake a weak candidate? Sure. Certainly she was a weak candidate when she ran for governor. She was a weak candidate this time around. But no matter what, there was a red wave that happened across the country, and Ruben was able to withstand it primarily because he just ran such a good campaign.
So bigger picture, if we think about, we all know that Arizona tends to have an independent streak. The fact that Arizona will probably once again have 2 Democratic U.S. senators in Gallego and Kelly, and yet, as Roy pointed out, Donald Trump won by 5 or 6 points in the state once we see the final numbers. Is there a schizophrenic quality to that, or is it just that Arizonans tend to, when it comes to these bigger races, statewide races, tend to pick the person they think lines up best with their values? We don't always see that in the House races, but those are, of course, redistricted and gerrymandered. But does that apply to the statewide races?
Yeah. No, Steve, I think candidates matter. And if you recall, Martha McSally was not viewed as a very strong candidate when she lost the first time to Kirsten Sinema. But then Doug Ducey appointed her to serve again in the U.S. Senate, and she was challenged by Mark Kelly. And a lot of Republicans were disappointed in, well, first from Governor Ducey to appoint her, because a lot of us felt that she was the weakest candidate. And so, and it proved to be so. And then the same thing happened again. You have Carrie Lake, who wins the primary and was not a strong candidate. So I think in both instances, if Republicans that would have had what I would consider to be a stronger candidate that they would have put up, then I think that both of our U.S. senators would be Republican today.
Boy, that's an interesting point, because if I look at it from the standpoint of just having covered this for a long time, obviously never having run for office or worked on a campaign, but it seems to me, having lived in Arizona as long as I have, that the campaign that Kirsten Sinema ran when she won the Senate seat, we always talked about how her ads were very much independent. Mark Kelly, with his legendary bio and of course marriage to Gabby Giffords, and then Ruben Gallego, it just seems like these are three really strong candidates, and based a little bit more on what they bring to the table as opposed to registration advantage. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, they are strong candidates, but I still believe, Roy might disagree with me, but I still believe Arizona is a Republican state. Arizona is a center-right state. And if you have good Republican candidates will win in Arizona. And when you have weak candidates pit against stronger candidates that are disciplined, that move more to the middle. It's interesting, Mark Kelly and moved way to the center when he ran, and a lot of folks think he's moved back to the left. A lot of folks think the same thing of Ruben Gallego, that he's going to move back to the left once he's a U.S. senator. But as far as campaigns go, Steve, I think that Republicans have not had the kinds of candidates that, in my opinion, they needed to win those elections.
Roy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Jaime says. I mean, it's hard to disagree that, at least at this point, given the results of the election this week, that Arizona is not a, let's say center-right state. I mean, if you look at the results at the state legislature, for example, where Democrats probably will lose a couple of seats in each chamber and it'll be a Republican majority again. You look at the congressional delegation. But, again, you look at the statewide and you do see, obviously, a Democratic governor and there's going to be 2 Democratic U.S. senators. So I think it does demonstrate that Arizonans, there is an element of independence. Obviously, the independents, I think, decide a lot of these close races at the statewide level, in which, if it's the right Democratic candidate, and clearly Ruben Gallego, Mark Kelly, Sinema, when she was a Democrat, were the right Democratic candidates that were able to pull out those victories. And I imagine, if there's going to be lessons, and there's going to be many lessons, I think the Democrats need to learn from the results of this election this week. One of the lessons is going to be to look at, how Ruben Gallego and how Mark Kelly ran their races, because those are the kinds of races that have been able to be victorious in battleground states. In a state like Arizona, where, either from a registration advantage or just in general history, Democrats have some disadvantage that they have to work against and overcome. You have to win at the statewide level as a Democrat, some element of Republicans, as well as win independents. And you just, again, looking back to kind of my earlier point, if you've got, Trump winning the state by 5 or 6 points, and you've got Rubin winning the state by 2 or 3 points, there's a big delta there of Trump Gallego voters that he was able to break through. And I think going forward, Democrats are going to have to figure out how to get those voters to vote for Democrats up and down the ticket.
Roy, let's go back to 2022 then briefly. Not to lump all Democrats in, I don't mean that, but was there a large, potentially too large group of Democrats who, even with good candidates like Katie Hobbs and Adrian Fontes and Chris Mays, were really helped by running against, in some cases, election deniers? Was that a case where some Democrats were thinking maybe they won too much based on their candidates as opposed to the weakness of the other candidates?
I think there's a little bit of that. I mean, I think, the candidates in a lot of instances in 2022 were election deniers. You also have to remember that this was, the election right after the Dobbs decision. So, the issue of reproductive rights and abortion was sort of top of mind, I think even more so back in 2022 than it is now. I mean, when I look at this race, and I know we'll probably get into it a little bit more as far as explaining what occurred, this election cycle, I kind of view it as both micro and macro explanation. The micro explanation, which in some ways, like Democrats really couldn't do much about, is just the fact that President Biden is just historically unpopular. I mean, that's just a reality. He's been underwater pretty much his entire first term, probably had his lowest mark on approval this year, obviously bad timing. And Harris, as his vice president, I think had a really hard time, and in some instances probably didn't try as hard as she should have to differentiate herself from Biden. So I think that is just something that was very, very difficult for Democrats to overcome nationwide. But the more macro problem, and this just goes back to the future, is just thinking about what motivated voters this time around. I believe that it was the economy. And when you think about things like, inflation, the cost of living being so high, the cost of food, the cost of gas, in Arizona in particular, the cost of housing, it's even expensive to buy a car. All of these things were things that I think voters were mad about. And the Democrats just did a poor job in explaining, what they would do to address those issues. On top of the fact that, of course, President Biden has been in office for the last 3 years. So it's fixing that messaging, I think, is going to be key for Democrats going forward. Otherwise, we're going to have results like we just did.
Yeah, Jaime, how much of it was messaging as far as you're concerned, and how much was the candidates?
Well, I agree with Roy. I think the Democrats need to rethink, but the problem that they had was a little bit deeper, in my opinion. I just think that there was a lot of frustration by Americans with the economy. There's certainly a lot of frustration with border security, and I think those things are somewhat tied together, because Americans, when they get angst about whether or not they're going to have jobs or whether or not they're going to be able to afford homes, and then they see how much money is being put into dealing with folks that come across illegally, I think that creates, whether it's myth or reality, creates a lot of angst out there. And then I think that's a bad recipe for Democrats. It traditionally is. Every time the border security is one of the top things that people were worried about, then Republicans tend to do well. The other issue is, I think, and it bled into the Democrats' ability to keep Latino men and African-American men. And I think that was a big problem. I mean, that was a huge turnout for Trump that a lot of folks were surprised by. And I really wasn't. And one of the reasons, and I've talked about this before, is that I think there's a lot of frustration with a lot of the wokeness that the Democrats tend to be associated with. And I think people are starting to get frustrated with these kinds of cultural issues that feel like it's undermining a lot of what they believe in, a lot of their faith. So that's something also that the Republicans have been able to differentiate themselves from. And I think that's, particularly in this election cycle, it proved to be a pretty powerful message.
Well, Jaime, before Roy jumps in, I wanted to ask a follow-up on that, though. Is it the idea that these folks may disagree with the cultural issues, or they think there's too much emphasis? Because some of these cultural issues are really boiled down to civil rights. So in that sense, you'd think that people would be, or do you think that they're saying that Democrats and progressives are talking about that more than they're talking about the economy and border security?
Well, that's what the Republicans are painting them as, right? That they're Republicans are painting them as, well, all they want to do is help transgender males that are in prison get operations and get money for operations so that they can be whatever gender they want to be. I think that was one of the most effective Trump ads that was out there when it ran the last few weeks of the campaign. So, Steve, it's not so much whether or not it's right or wrong. Again, it's that perception that is leading a lot of folks, again, and not in my opinion, within the Latino community, and it looks as though within the African-American community. And I think as the days and weeks, as people start to really dive into the data and look at and start to interview folks as to why they made those kinds of decisions, I think that's going to be one of the things that's going to be out there, and it'll be pretty prominent.
Roy, did those wedge issues work against Democrats, whether it was honestly working against them or just perception?
Well, I mean, I do think sort of the basic question is like, do those voters, those Latino men, Black men that shifted towards Trump this election cycle, do they agree with the Democrats on the issue or not? Versus, as you ask, like whether it's just the problem of it seems like Democrats are only focused on that in lieu of focusing on economic issues, which are more important to those individuals. I think it's more to the latter. In other words, I do think that the Republicans were very good. And, we've seen reporting on this, like the transgender ad, like some of these other ads on these wedge issues seem to be very effective this cycle. And I tend to believe it's not so much because those men, for example, are necessarily agreeing with what is in that ad. Maybe they do, some do, maybe some don't. But I think it basically painted Democrats as out of touch, right? Just generally, because Democrats weren't focused on, again, sort of like the bottom line issues, the kitchen table issues about how things are so expensive. So I think that is a big piece there. And the other thing that I think, and I'm doing a lot of soul searching, like a lot of Democrats, I don't know what stage of grief I'm in at this point this week, but just sort of thinking through again, like how do we get a lot of those voters back? And one thing I do think that the Democrats don't do a great job of, and it's just something that I learned throughout my political career that I really believe in, is sometimes you have to meet voters where they are on issues. And sometimes you can't, have a litmus test and say, all right, for you to vote for me, I need you to agree with me on 10 out of 10 issues. And, if you agree with me on 8 out of the 10, that's not good enough. Those last 2 issues, make me think that you're not good or you're dumb or you're bad, right? And I think that sort of judgment happens too often with some elements of my party that makes people feel unwelcome. And I think like that is something that needs to be addressed going forward a bit. And that's not to say that Democrats should sort of betray their own values, that kind of thing. But I think there has to be a fine line between, again, sort of being, pure about everything and again, sort of expressing judgment on individuals if they don't agree with you on everything. I think that's got to change because I think a lot of, the Latino men and Black men that we're talking about, they felt like the Democrats weren't focusing on the issues that were most important to them. And I think in some instances, they probably felt like they weren't welcome either.
Well, Jaime, it's remarkable because I think back to 2012, I think when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, when President Obama was reelected, and there was this push, first of all, to have some sort of postmortem for how to change the Republican Party, but it was also this demographic shift meant that Republicans were never going to win elections again because Latinos and Latinas were always going to be with Democrats. And now we see, obviously, it took probably less than a decade for that to change around. So in that sense, I mean, how much do we even take from this election? Is this something the effects could last for a long time, or could it just be one cycle or two?
Well, I think it'll change based on who's going to be better about trying to attract, in this case, the Latino community. I've always felt that the Republicans have not paid enough attention to Latinos, and I think the Democrats take them for granted. So I still believe that every election cycle, there's a good opportunity, just like with everybody, to really come out and start to have that dialogue as to why, in this case, why Republicans would be a better fit for the Latino community. I've always felt that, just because I believe from a cultural, from a religious, from a patriotic standpoint, I think the Latinos tend to be very tight with, or they should be tight with the Republican Party, but Republicans have been awful about reaching out and in trying to engage the Latino community. In this case, I think President Trump was successful, again, because I feel that a lot of Latinos, and particularly Latino men, felt the Democrats, it wasn't so much Republicans came to them and reached out, it was more that the Democratic Party moved away from them. And they felt, I think Roy's right, whether it was the issues of wokeness that was a problem, they felt like, well, they weren't focused on the issues that were important to them. But again, the perception was that they're looking at issues that the Democratic Party was saying was a priority, but it really wasn't to them. So I think in future election cycles, I mean, it'll flip around. I mean, everybody's thinking that this is going to be the be all end all. And we've seen through history, it always changes. I mean, 4 years from now, we'll barely remember what we talked about today.
Yeah, Roy, maybe your grief can last just a short time.
Well, I hope so, certainly. But, I think I agree with what Jaime just said. We were just presenting to another group yesterday or a couple of days ago about this. You can view this as, wow, this is a realignment. This is going to be sort of a change that lasts for like more than a couple election cycles. But, I think what we have seen in recent political history is that like that will not be the case. I mean, if you go back to 2020, which is 4 short years ago, the Democrats won a bunch of Senate seats, won a bunch of House seats, won the presidency. And I think there was probably an equal feeling in the Republican Party, right after that of like, where do we go from here? Like, how do we, how do we get back? And here we are 4 short years later, the Republican Party is going to have total control in DC most likely. And so there's a herky-jerkiness to, I think how politics works these days. And I think it's a reflection, quite honestly, that a lot of the electorate is just unhappy, so they're just sort of searching for which side, is going to be better for them. I think the one thing that probably does, though, and Jaime hit the nail on the head on this, that gives, I think, Democrats, or needs to give Democrats the most pause when we're thinking about this, is that the party's support, has really become pretty narrow, at least what we've seen in this election cycle, where it's limited to people that, are highly educated. It's limited to people that are, for the most part, well off or wealthy. And at the same time, we're bleeding working class people, which that has happened for a long time. But in particular, this time, working class Latinos and Black men, which, again, if that's the case going forward, then there would be a legitimately bad, problem for Democrats for a number of years, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think Democrats, to Jaime's point, in a lot of ways have taken the Latino community and also the Black community sometimes for granted, just assuming that they would always be with them. And, obviously, that is not what happened this election cycle. So the party needs to do a hard look to make sure that those folks come back to the party, which inevitably means you got to sort of cater to what those folks, those segments of the electorate are most focused on.
Gentlemen, just about 2 minutes left, so short answer on this one, please. Jaime, Prop 140, full disclosure, I was involved in the very, very early stages of that and then was not involved for the last year and a half or so. But Prop 140 rather than 133, let's focus on that for like 30 seconds. Independents still are sort of on the outside looking in, at least some would say, and that was defeated soundly. Was that because voters were confused or something else?
It was a bad proposition. As you know, I was somewhat giddy when I saw the results on that particular initiative, but I think it was very poorly written. It was very confusing. And once again, it tried to be a silver bullet that a lot of folks said, you can't upend our election process with something that we really don't understand. And that's what they tried to do.
Roy, what do you think? 30 seconds.
Well, obviously I have a conflict here too. I was against it. Well, I was one of the ones that brought the legal challenge for full disclosure. Yeah. But I agree with what Jaime said. I think that most voters found it to be particularly confusing with the way that it was written. It was hard to sort of, it didn't really take a position on what the reform would be, just that there would be reform. I think that was a mistake. And, at the end of the day, the two parties both came together against it. And that makes it difficult, I think, for anybody to win. And the last thing I'll just say is I think Arizona voters are very discerning on ballot initiatives. And that's what we saw here.
Right. But vote no if you're confused at all, right? That's the history we all know of. So
Exactly.
Jaime Molera of Molera Alverez, great to see you. Thank you. Roy Herrera, attorney and former congressional staffer. Roy, always great to catch up with you. Thanks very much to both of you for joining us here on the Press Room.
Thank you so much.
And thank all of you as well for watching and listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein. Take care.